Hey everybody, so I want to share the tools that are needed to install a laminate floor, whether it's luxury vinyl tile or if it's just a plain regular laminate. So here are the tools that I use when I'm installing a laminate vinyl tile or luxury vinyl tile, however you want to call it. It's the laminate vinyl, the vinyl plain flooring. First and most important tools of all, knife, tape measure, speed square, and tapping block. If you have a rectangular room, you can pretty much get away with just these tools. At the end of the row, you'll always need a pry bar. Because you're on the floor all day, you want to keep your joints in good shape. Knee pads. A good jigsaw on hand, always, to get those funny shapes cut out. And of course, when we start the first row, I shoot it with my laser level. If you have a long rip, the other thing I can add would basically be a circular saw or a table saw on site would be good too, because scoring and snapping long edges are a little bit more difficult than you want. So again, I keep a circular saw in the back pocket there. And that way, if we have a long rip, we pull that out and we just score it right through. Make sure you read the instructions. This is probably the biggest tool to have on hand. If the box does not come with instructions, maybe look online and see what it comes with. That is the essential list of tools that you need to install LVT, EVP, whatever you want to call it, the vinyl plank flooring. So when I get started with my flooring jobs, I like to lay out the longest wall first. Now we're on a site here where we're almost finished, but in order to see how we started, let me show you. Over here in the other room, we've picked our starting point, and it's simply the longest wall and the most visual wall. This is what you're looking for. The largest room or length of a hallway, and you're gonna run it along the hallway to get your first row all started. So now, let me show you how we start it. This product tells us that we should be starting with the tongue side of the board out. So this is the tongue side, this is considered the groove side in the vinyl planks or laminate floors. And with the tongue side facing out, it allows us to come in and step our edges in and then just drop them down. But how do we start the very first piece? Well, the key to starting the first piece is always to cut a little bit off the end, not to make it a full board. That way, it offsets your next joint. And as we go through the rows, we'll have a piece at the very end, and you generally have to cut off maybe 1-2 feet, or it's really close to the end. Ideally, you want to keep something that's 8 to 12 inches long, or if it's a little bit longer, it's even better. And you take that end piece, and it ends up becoming a new starter piece. So at the end of the row, whatever you cut off, well, they come back here, and they end up serving as your first starter piece. I use a knife and a speed square to cut the boards. Let me show you how. This material is a score and snap. So a couple lines across. And just like that, after I've scored the board a few times, you can either snap it over your knee, or you can use a hammer, and now this becomes a new starter piece. So I've got a clean starting edge, offset to my joint. If I had a full board here, I can remove 6-7 inches. That's how you would start your second row on the board if you didn't have a long enough piece from the end row. So installation, especially for this material, is getting the long edge in first, and you know it's in when the board lays down on its own. These short offcuts that are too small to use as starters or ends, we basically take them and use their groove edge and a rubber mallet to tap them in. And once we tap them slightly, not too hard, just enough, you can see that the board will lay flat. That means it's actually engaged in the seam properly. And now what we can do is we can butt it into the edge. When you get to walls where you have new drywall or old construction of some sort, it's best to use spacer blocks. So you can either use a piece of the flooring itself to stop it from going too far, or you can create your own shims out of wood and you space them into the back here so that you have a gap, and it creates what we call a breathing room. So this is a 1/4 inch gap, 3/8 at most, around the whole perimeter of the space. So now, with this piece in place, I'll simply come to the end and just tap. Now, the same thing happens when I get to my next piece. I'm now into a full board. So no more partial boards or starter pieces, now we go full boards. And the idea here is, again, we line our long seam in, light taps. Finding it standing up just a bit, so that means we need to give it a little bit more love. Laying down nice and flat. Now, what you want to do is create a gap here. You don't want to have this trying to be engaged because you might break the tips. So watching this very carefully to make sure the planes are flush, we go back to the far end over here, and we tap to the end, watching that to make sure it goes in. Just enough so that the seams are closed. We want them nice and tight. Now, the reason for this is so that we don't have any issues with water spillage getting through. Even though we have a nice subfloor, it keeps it watertight, they say. So it's just that simple. Basically, all we're doing is laying rows, and we get to the far end, we just do the last piece. Now, the trick for the last piece is quite simple. For the last piece, what we like to do is flip it backwards, okay? And by flipping it backwards, it allows us to butt this piece right up to the edge. You'll see that I've allowed for this gap. This is about 1/4 inch, exactly what we want for our breathing room. So now I put a pencil mark there where it lines up that lip. Now I simply take the speed square and a knife, put a scrap piece underneath it to keep it away from the good floor. Once that's done, again, we'll come up, break it, fold it back. And because we marked it in reverse, you can now just go like this. Snap our piece in, and then we'll work it backwards. Now with the end pieces, what happens, it gets a little bit tight. So that's why I like to have a pry bar on hand. So a pry bar and scrap material, you basically lean in, and you just give it a little push. There we go. A little bit awkward play. It doesn't always go perfect, but as you can see, nice tight line. Got our gap at this end down here. Makes for a clean, easy installation. One of the things we run into often is installing into a room that transitions through. Now, with this, you can use transition pieces, such as these, reducers, and T-molds. Now, what you can see about these profiles is that a T-mold will be perfectly flat. It's T-mold. And the reducers have a different shape. They go from one height to the next height. So this is a reducer. So you can see this is the high point where it rests up on the higher floor and dip down to the lower floor. So that's the piece that we'd use when we go from this floor down. And the flooring is going to end in the doorway to go to the concrete, and then we'd use a reducer here to go down to the concrete if we want to protect the nosing. And then over here, with the transition of this room, you could drop a strip for a T-mold, or what I like to do is install the pieces, but now you're going in the opposite direction. So you're actually installing in reverse order. So we'll cut a piece, make it cohesive, so it's one unitary floor. So now we're going to basically come in here, install a piece backwards, cut out the doorway openings, and run it all the way through into this little room here. Because the room's so small, it works well. Do the same thing on a bedroom. You can see two different styles. You'll see the T-mold, or you'll see cohesive, where it goes all the way across. There's nothing wrong with actually doing a T-mold. I just prefer to keep the flooring whole all the way through, so that way when you open the door, there's no little threshold to bump over. So because the flooring runs one direction, we are now looking at installing the floor in the reverse pattern. First things first, mark your piece. So I'm going to measure the depth from here, and I'm going to make sure I add 1/4 inch. I'm leaving 1/4 inch relief against the 2x4s too. 3 3/4. So now, this is one of those cuts. It's a square notch into the piece. So it makes it a little bit more difficult. Scoring it with the blade doesn't really work. So this is the kind of cut I'm gonna use my jigsaw on, or my circ saw. I've got my piece cut perfectly. And you can see, with it cut, all I'm going to do is lean in the opposite direction, line the edges up. Make sure you're on the same level. That's it. So now it's starting our first piece to getting through this doorway. It's nice, it's tight, fits clean. Now all we're gonna do is continue this pattern all the way back, working backwards. So you see here, the piece is cut on this width. So what we're gonna end up doing now is putting the short piece here to finish it, stuck our next row in. Same thing is on this side over here. We're gonna run in that same issue, short little strip across here, making use of our offcuts. So now you can see the full transition between these pieces. You get the line of the seams dead on. Otherwise your next piece will not install properly. And again, you can always come back and push them into the piece with the pry bar. So we have our next row started. Now we can go with full pieces all the way in until we finish back here. Here's an area where we get into quite a bit. We run into a threshold of a doorway again, but this doorway has the casing already in it. So what we're gonna use is a special tool. This one is an oscillating cutter. This is my rigid oscillating cutter. I have a couple of these ones. Basically, you're gonna take the blade and use it on a scrap piece to come in and make this cut. So pre-mark this piece to go into here. It's cut so it marks to the doorway. Ideally, we don't want to take too much off because we run into this spot where there's already a door jamb. Now, unlike our other two doorways, they have no jams yet, so the flooring can go right up to the studs. So I'm going to remove this piece. I'm going to take a piece of scrap and I'm going to call on my oscillating cutter. We call this the flush door cutter, multi-tools, lots of different names, but this one here has a flat oscillating blade that's going to come in and we're going to cut to the underside of this so that piece will go in. Before I do that, safety first. Rubber mallet and our tapping block. Sits down nice and tight. We'll put our baseboard across here, so then it'll hide that little gap, which we're supposed to have. And this is a nice clean installation. So now, all I'm gonna do is go ahead and move along, starting on the right-hand side and going left all the way back. And again, we're installing in reverse order here because we're working from the doorway into a room. So when it comes down to installing the last row of flooring, there's a trick to be had. A, measure your pieces enough so that there's still a wall gap and tolerance to allow for a pry bar to push your piece in. With the pry bar in place, the first piece goes in quite easily. The next piece is where it becomes tricky. Every consecutive piece has the same technique. You drop the long edge in first, push the pry bar, and then we'll use our tapping block on the ends, tap them in, and lock the ends together. As you can see, you can't even tell where the seam is. This stuff looks so good. Push it in, you get that little pry bar, and you can feel if it's ramping up and wants to kick up a bit, then you know it's not engaged. But when it's engaged, it drops and it gets flat and it feels smooth. So doing this is how you finish your row off, all the way across until you get to the end. And that's how you finish your last row of vinyl plank flooring. So it doesn't take a lot of tools to install this material, and it goes in really fast and easy. So, hope you like the video. Make sure you comment, like, and subscribe. Let me know if you have any more questions on how to install laminate flooring. Story to tale. Tale of the story. I'm trying to ramble here. Cut it, Nick.